Imagine being a respected judge, driving through your own neighborhood, only to be pulled over by a cop who instantly assumes you've stolen your own car. What would you do if, despite your authority and accomplishments, you were treated like a criminal simply because of your race? And when the truth finally comes out, how do you think the officer will react upon realizing who you truly are? This shocking story will make you question, how often does this happen? And what does it take for justice to truly prevail? Before we begin this heartfelt story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Eli Matthews brushed a speck of dust off the dashboard of his brand new Audi. It was only a week old, but he already treated it like a prized possession. The leather seats had barely lost their factory shine, and the smooth purr of the engine gave him a sense of satisfaction that felt almost tangible. He had just left his office at the courthouse, a long day behind him filled with back-to-back hearings, paperwork, and the weight of other people's problems. This drive down the wide, tree-lined streets of Somerset Hills, Maryland, was his favorite part of the day. It allowed him a moment to decompress, to feel in control again. The calm streets, with their sprawling homes set back from the road, were a sharp contrast to the tension that often followed him at work. But the momentary peace didn't last long. Just as Eli started humming along with the smooth rhythm of the jazz on the radio, flashing blue and red lights pierced the evening calm. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the unmistakable sight of a police cruiser tailing him. His heart skipped a beat, and his fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel. He pulled over without hesitation, confused but compliant. The neighborhood was quiet, far from the chaos of city life, and Eli hadn't been speeding. In fact, he'd been driving under the limit, enjoying the leisurely drive home after a long week. So what could he have possibly done wrong? A sharp rap on the window cut through his thoughts. Eli turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered officer peering down at him, her face unreadable, her hand resting conspicuously close to the gun holstered at her side. "License and registration," she barked. Without the courtesy of a greeting, Eli complied silently, reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve his documents. The officer, her nameplate reading Officer Daniels, snatched the papers from his hands without so much as a glance in his direction. She scanned the documents, her eyes narrowing as they darted back and forth between the papers and Eli himself. "Step out of the car," she ordered. Eli blinked. "Excuse me?" "Out. Now," she repeated, her voice harder this time, leaving no room for argument. Eli hesitated for a moment, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. He was a judge, a respected one at that. In fact, he had presided over cases that likely involved Officer Daniels' department. He was on familiar ground in Somerset Hills, a place where he knew people, where he was known. And yet, here he was, being treated like a suspect. "Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding. I'm Judge Eli Matthews. This is my car, and I live just down the street," he explained, keeping his tone measured. Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow, her hand shifting ever so slightly toward her gun. "Step out. Now." Swallowing the rising wave of indignation, Eli complied. He wasn't going to make things worse, not here, not now. He opened the door and stepped out, standing beside his car as Officer Daniels eyed him with a look that sent a chill down his spine. She walked around him slowly, as if sizing him up. "We've had reports of a vehicle like this stolen last week," she said, her eyes fixed on him as though he'd confessed to the crime himself. Eli's jaw tightened. "This is my car. I purchased it from the dealership a few days ago. If you run the plates, it will come back clean." She didn't seem to hear him, or maybe she didn't care. "Hands on the hood," she snapped, stepping toward him. "This is unnecessary," Eli protested, his patience fraying at the edges. "I've done nothing wrong." Officer Daniels' eyes glinted with something he couldn't quite place. Was it suspicion or something more sinister? "You're going to do as I say, or we'll have a problem," she said, her voice hard and unyielding. Eli's blood ran hot, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He wasn't just anyone. He knew how to handle situations like this. He knew his rights, and he knew the law. Yet, despite everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved. It felt as though none of that mattered right now. With a deep breath, Eli complied, placing his hands on the hood of the car. He felt the eyes of nearby residents on him. Curtains twitching as neighbors peeked out to watch the spectacle unfolding in front of them. The humiliation stung more than anything else. He had worked his entire life to rise above moments like these, to prove himself, to be respected. But here he was, being reduced to a common suspect in front of the people he lived among. Officer Daniels began patting him down roughly, her movements brusque and devoid of any respect. "We've had reports of car thieves in the area," she said. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week." Eli clenched his jaw. "I already told you. This car was purchased a few days ago. If you'll allow me to explain—" "Save it for the station," she interrupted, reaching for her handcuffs. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Clearly, Officer Daniels, I suggest you call your superior before you make a decision you'll regret." Her hand hovered above the cuffs. "You expect me to believe that?" Eli looked her in the eye, unwavering. "I expect you to verify my identity and do your job properly." Something shifted in her expression, just a flicker of uncertainty. Her confidence wavered, and she took a step back. With a huff of frustration, she reached for her radio and muttered into it, keeping her gaze locked on Eli. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Eli stood there, hands still on the car, while Officer Daniels kept glancing between him and her radio, waiting for confirmation. The air between them crackled with tension, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Neighbors were still peeking from behind their curtains, witnessing his humiliation. Finally, the radio crackled to life, and a voice came through on the other end. "Daniels, stand down immediately. Judge Matthews is a respected member of the community. I'm on my way." Eli straightened, feeling a surge of relief. But the damage had already been done. His dignity had been tarnished, and no amount of apologies could erase the humiliation he'd endured. Officer Daniels' face flushed with embarrassment as she lowered her radio. She hesitated for a moment, then muttered, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Eli adjusted his jacket, his composure regained, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "A misunderstanding," he echoed, his voice calm but firm. "That's what we're calling racial profiling now, officer." Before she could respond, another police car pulled up, and a tall man with graying hair stepped out. Captain Monroe, head of the local precinct, approached with an air of urgency. "Judge Matthews," he called out as he approached, his expression grave. "I can't begin to apologize enough for this incident. Rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of it." Eli nodded, but his mind was already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had been wrongly accused, harassed, or profiled. And now, as he stood there with Captain Monroe offering his apologies, Eli made a decision that would change the course of his life and the lives of many others. "Captain," Eli said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I'd like to speak with you and Officer Daniels, not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this incident into an opportunity for real change." Captain Monroe looked taken aback by the request, but there was respect in his eyes. "Of course, Your Honor. Whatever you need." Eli nodded and glanced around at the neighborhood, the quiet street, the houses with their curtains still drawn. He had worked too hard to be reduced to this, to be seen as nothing more than a suspect, as a threat. But he also knew that moments like this could become something more. They could be the catalyst for growth, for understanding, for change. As they walked toward Captain Monroe's car, Eli couldn't help but wonder if this moment, this public humiliation, could be the start of something bigger. Could this be the spark that ignited real conversations about the system, about justice, about what it meant to be truly seen for who you were, not the color of your skin? Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, prejudice, and the power of one person to make a difference.